I still remember the night I got the call about Margaret Theut's disappearance. It was December 3rd, 2011, and the chill of Detroit cut through my coat like a knife. The neighborhood near Rouge Park was swallowed by a thick, oppressive darkness. The wind howled through skeletal trees, whispering secrets I couldn't yet decipher. A neighbor, her voice trembling over the phone, said Margaret, a 71-year-old woman living alone, had been missing for nearly a week. "She never misses lunch with me," the woman said. "Last Monday she didn't show up." I knew something was wrong. When I arrived at the house on Patton Street, the scene hit me like a punch to the gut. The iron gate out front hung wide open, swaying in the wind as if someone had bolted out in a hurry and didn't bother locking it. Margaret Theut wasn't careless. Neighbors said she was meticulous, almost obsessive about keeping things in order. I stepped toward the porch, the dim streetlight casting shadows on the windows. The faint hum of a TV drifted out, an old talk show no one was watching. I knocked on the door. No answer. Just the frantic barking of a small dog. Later I'd learn it was her beloved companion, echoing from behind the weathered wooden door. Teresa, the neighbor who asked us to hide her name, stood beside me, her hands shaking as she pointed at the house. "The TV's still on, but no one's there. She'd never leave her dog alone like that. And her car, the beige Impala, it's gone." I jotted it down. Gate open, TV running, dog abandoned, car missing. The first pieces of a puzzle I didn't yet know how to solve. We forced the door open. No time to wait for a warrant. Inside, the air was heavy, tinged with a faint, musty smell. The kitchen was spotless. No signs of a struggle. But something felt off. A cold coffee mug sat on the table, half finished, like someone had walked away mid-sip. Teresa said she'd grown suspicious days earlier. Margaret didn't show up for their lunch date on Monday, November 28th. No call, no note. A woman as punctual as her didn't vanish like that without a word. I asked, "When did you last see her?" Teresa frowned, straining to recall. "Probably the evening of November 10th. She was out in the yard, said she'd see me soon." She smiled, but there was something in her eyes, like worry. The Impala was our first lead. An old car, not worth stealing, but it was gone. I considered she might have driven off herself, but why leave the gate open and abandon the dog? Then Teresa dropped a bombshell that sent a chill down my spine. I found the car, 8 blocks away, on Vaughan near Tireman. It was with the boyfriend of Teresa, the girl Margaret looked after as a kid. Teresa Alvarez. Her name hit my notebook for the first time, but I had no idea it'd soon be at the heart of this nightmare. That night, standing in Margaret Theut's empty house, I felt something dark lurking. No blood, no footprints, nothing obvious. But the cold wasn't just from Detroit's winter. It came from something deeper, a malice that had slithered into this kind woman's life. And I was damn well going to find it. The moment Teresa told me she'd found Margaret's Impala 8 blocks away, I knew this wasn't a simple missing persons case. It was December 5th, 2011, 2 days after that eerie night at the house, and the air in Detroit felt heavier, like the city itself was holding its breath. We raced to Vaughan Street near Tireman, a rundown stretch where the streetlights flickered like dying stars. There it was, the beige Impala, parked crookedly in a cracked driveway. A young guy, twitchy and avoiding eye contact, stood nearby. "It's my girl's car now," he muttered when I pressed him. His girl? Teresa Alvarez. I ran the plates. It was Margaret's, no question. But how the hell did it end up here? The guy, some lowlife named Ricky, claimed Teresa had given it to him a few weeks back. Said it was hers to give. He shrugged. I didn't buy it. Margaret wasn't the type to hand over her car to a punk like him, let alone through Teresa, a girl she hadn't seen regularly in years. I impounded the vehicle and called in forensics. No blood, no prints, just a faint smell of bleach lingering in the upholstery. Someone had cleaned it thoroughly. That's when the first real chill hit me. This wasn't random. Someone was covering their tracks. Teresa Alvarez's name kept gnawing at me. Teresa filled me in. Margaret had known her since she was a kid, back when Teresa and her brother Jesus were practically strays, left with Margaret by a neighbor who died of cancer. Margaret had taken them in, fed them, even adopted Jesus later. Teresa went to a great aunt, but Margaret stayed in her life, a kind of guardian angel. Now that angel was missing, and Teresa's boyfriend had her car. Coincidence? My gut screamed no. I tracked Teresa down the next day, December 6th. She was 23 then, a former Taco Bell manager with a rap sheet. Embezzlement, caught skimming cash in 2011. She was on probation when Margaret vanished. I found her at a dingy apartment off Grand River, all fake smiles and nervous energy. Margaret? Oh, she killed herself, she said, casual as if she were talking about the weather. Overdosed on pills. I went to her funeral and everything. Funeral. No one else had mentioned a funeral. I pressed her. When? Where? She stumbled, said it was private, just her and a few friends. Her eyes darted to the floor. She was lying through her teeth. That lie was the first crack in her armor. I dug deeper. Neighbors hadn't seen Margaret since November 10th. Same night Teresa last saw her. Teresa claimed she'd visited Margaret around then, to check on her. But the car turning up with Ricky? She brushed it off. Margaret gave it to me before she died. Bullshit. Margaret's friends said she'd never part with that Impala. It was her lifeline. And the bleach smell? Teresa had no answer for that. Then came the kicker. A buddy of Teresa's, some punk she'd bragged to, let slip she'd been flaunting cash lately. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Margaret wasn't rich, but she'd saved up, planning to donate it to charity. Had Teresa known? I pictured her plotting, that fake funeral story spinning in her head while she wiped down the car. The cruelty of it started sinking in, not just the act, but the performance. She'd dressed up, played the grieving friend, all while knowing exactly where Margaret was. That's not just cold, that's inhuman. By the end of that week, I knew Teresa was our suspect. The car was the first clue, but it was her lies that lit the fuse. Somewhere out there, Margaret's body was waiting, hidden by a girl she'd once saved from the streets. The nightmare was just beginning. May 2012 hit Detroit like a damp shroud, the kind of spring where the air clings to your skin and the ground never quite dries. I'd been chasing shadows in the Margaret Theut case for 6 months. 6 months of dead ends, Teresa Alvarez's smug lies, and a growing dread that we'd never find her. Then, on May 15th, a call crackled through the radio. A woman hunting mushrooms near the Rouge River in Rouge Park had stumbled onto something. Bones, human bones, wrapped in a bathrobe and blankets. My stomach dropped. I knew it was her before I even got there. Rouge Park sprawls across Detroit's west side, a wild tangle of trees and trails that feels more like a forgotten world than a city park. I pulled up to the scene, boots sinking into the muddy earth. The air was thick with the smell of rot and wet leaves, a sickly sweet stench that stuck in your throat. The mushroom hunter stood off to the side, pale and shaking, pointing toward a shallow gully. I thought it was trash at first, she stammered. Then I saw a hand. I followed her gaze. There, Half buried under a pile of soggy debris was a bundle. Too deliberate, too human. My team cordoned off the area, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The wind rustling the trees like a low, mocking laugh. We peeled back the layers. First a tattered blanket, then a faded blue bathrobe, stiff with decay. Underneath was what remained of Margaret Theut. The body was skeletal, flesh long gone, eaten away by time and the elements. Her skull grinned up at us, teeth intact. Dental records would confirm it later that week. No obvious trauma, no bullet holes or knife wounds. How did she die? That was the first mystery. The wrapping was another. Someone had taken care, folded the robe, tucked the blanket tight, like they were laying her to rest. But this wasn't respect. This was calculation. No fingerprints, no stray hairs, nothing sloppy. Whoever did this knew how to hide a body. I crouched by the remains, piecing it together. 6 months in the open, exposed to rain and scavengers. Yet the wrapping held. That meant she'd been dumped soon after she vanished. Likely November 2011, right around when Teresa said she'd checked on her. The spot wasn't random either. Rouge Park was 2 blocks from Margaret's house. A place she'd walked her dog, a place Teresa knew well. Hell, Teresa had lived there as a kid, huddled with her brother and grandparents under tarps when they had nowhere else to go. Margaret had pulled her out of that misery, and now here she was, discarded in the same damn dirt. The cruelty of it burned in my chest. This wasn't just murder. This was a twisted middle finger to everything Margaret had done for her. Forensics came up empty on a murder weapon. No bloodstains, no rope marks. Nothing to say how Teresa did it. Her story about a pill overdose nagged at me. Maybe she'd forced them down Margaret's throat, staged it as suicide. But without tissue left to test, we'd never know for sure. The bathrobe was Margaret's. Neighbors recognized the pattern, but the blanket wasn't from her house. Where'd it come from? Another riddle. Teresa had scrubbed the car with bleach, and now this meticulous burial. She wasn't just covering tracks, she was erasing Margaret entirely. Standing there in that gully, I saw the depth of Teresa's malice. She'd planned this, weeks, maybe months, lured Margaret into trust, then snuffed her out. The body dump wasn't panic, it was deliberate. A final act of spite in a place that tied their lives together. She'd left Margaret to rot where she'd once been a scared little girl, a sick echo of the past. By the time I walked away from that scene, one thing was clear. Teresa Alvarez wasn't human. She was a predator, and I was going to cage her. By May 2012, the discovery of Margaret Theut's body in Rouge Park had turned a cold case into a blazing inferno. I'd stared into the void of that gully, seen the mockery Teresa Alvarez had made of her benefactor's life, and I wasn't letting it go. The bones gave us a where but not a how, or a definitive who. Teresa was still just a suspect, her lies about a pill overdose and a fake funeral hanging in the air like smoke. I needed proof, something to tie her to that muddy grave. The hunt was on, and every step pulled me deeper into her web of deceit. First, we circled back to the Impala. Forensics had found bleach, but now they dug deeper. Microfibers in the trunk matched the blanket wrapped around Margaret's body. It wasn't from her house. It was cheap, synthetic, the kind you'd find at a discount store. A clerk at a nearby Dollar General remembered Teresa buying one in early November 2011. Same week, Margaret vanished. She was in a hurry, the guy said. Paid cash, didn't look up. That blanket wasn't random. She'd bought it to bury Margaret, planned it down to the last detail. My blood ran cold, imagining her picking it out, knowing what it was for. Next came the money. Margaret wasn't wealthy, but she'd squirreled away thousands, savings meant for charity. Her bank records showed a withdrawal of $3,000 on November 11, 2011, the day after Teresa last saw her alive. The teller ID'd Teresa from a photo lineup. She had Margaret's debit card, said she was running an errand for her. Margaret's signature was on the slip, but shaky, forged. I'd bet my badge on it. Teresa had bragged to friends about coming into cash right after, flashing bills at bars while Margaret rotted in the park. That wasn't just greed, it was gloating. She'd killed her, robbed her, then partied on the proceeds. Witnesses started talking. A co-worker from Taco Bell said Teresa had been off in late 2011, ranting about needing money to start over after her embezzlement bust. Another friend recalled her planning the fake funeral weeks in advance, buying a black dress, rehearsing tears. She said Margaret was depressed, took too many pills, the friend told me. I believed her, until she laughed about it later. Laughed. That stuck with me. She'd spun this tale, played the grieving protege, all while knowing she'd dumped the body herself. The callousness was staggering. The timeline tightened. Phone records showed Teresa near Margaret's house on November 10th, her last known sighting. No calls after that. Margaret's phone went dead. Teresa's alibi. I was home alone. No one bought it. We searched her apartment, found a bottle of bleach and a pair of gloves stashed under the sink. Same brand as residue in the car. Not enough for a slam dunk, but it painted a picture. She'd lured Margaret into a trap, killed her, maybe with pills, maybe something else, cleaned up, and hauled her to the park. The how was still murky, but the why screamed loud. Money, pure and simple. Arrest day came in late May 2012, after the bones were ID'd. I slapped the cuffs on Teresa at that same Grand River apartment. She didn't flinch, just stared at me, eyes flat, like I was an inconvenience. You got nothing, she sneered. But we had enough. The car, the blanket, the bank withdrawal, the lies piling up like bricks. In interrogation, she stuck to her story. Margaret killed herself, until I showed her photos of the body. That's when she shut down, lips sealed, but her silence said it all. She'd thought she'd outsmarted us, lived her lie for 6 months without a crack. The cruelty wasn't just the murder, it was the calm, the confidence, the way she'd slept soundly while Margaret's bones bleached in the rain. By the time we booked her, I saw the monster clear as day. Teresa Alvarez hadn't just killed Margaret Theut. She'd erased her, step by calculated step, and danced on the grave. The web was unraveling, and I'd make damn sure she paid. December 11th, 2013, was a gray, bitter day in Detroit. The kind where the cold seeps into your bones and stays there. The Wayne County Circuit Court was packed. Neighbors, reporters, a few stragglers drawn by the grim spectacle of Teresa Alvarez's trial. I sat in the back, notebook worn from months of chasing her shadow. Margaret Theut's murder had torn a hole in this community. And now, after a year of digging through her lies, we were here to see justice done. The air buzzed with anger, but Teresa? She just sat there, blank-faced, like she was waiting for a bus. The prosecution laid it out like a horror story. The Impala with its bleach stink, the blanket she'd bought to wrap the body, the $3,000 snatched from Margaret's account, every piece we'd clawed from the dirt of Rouge Park and Teresa's web of deceit. Witnesses took the stand. The bank teller who'd seen her forge the signature, the friend who'd heard her laugh about the fake funeral, the coworker who'd caught her muttering about fixing her problems. The jury didn't flinch when they showed photos of the bones. Margaret's skull staring back, a silent accusation. I watched their faces harden. They felt it too. The betrayal, the calculated evil. One mystery lingered. How did Margaret die? No flesh left for an autopsy. No weapon found. The prosecutor leaned on Teresa's own words. That pill overdose she'd peddled to friends. A theory emerged. Maybe she'd crushed sedatives into Margaret's coffee that night, forced her to swallow, waited until she stopped breathing. The shaky signature on the bank slip backed it up. Margaret might have been dazed, coerced. Teresa's lawyer tried to poke holes, claimed it was all circumstantial, but the jury wasn't buying. The why was clear. Money. The how. We'd never know every detail, but the truth screamed through the gaps. Teresa took the stand late in the trial, her last shot to sell her lie. Margaret was depressed, she said, voice flat. She wanted to die. I just found her like that. No tears, no quiver, just a dead-eyed stare. I clenched my fists. She'd planned this for weeks, dumped the body, lived off the cash, and now she dared play victim? The courtroom bristled. A neighbor shouted, "Liar!" before the judge banged his gavel. Cross-examination shredded her. Why the bleach? Why the blanket? Why the money? She had no answers, just shrugs. That shrug, it was her confession, louder than words. The verdict came fast. Guilty, first-degree murder. Premeditated, cold-blooded. On December 12th, Judge Mark Slavens handed down the sentence. Life without parole, mandatory for the charge. The room exhaled, a mix of relief and rage. I locked eyes with Teresa as they cuffed her. No remorse, no fear, just that same empty gaze, like she was already somewhere else. She'd killed Margaret, erased her from the world, and even now, facing a concrete cage, she didn't care. That was the cruelest part. Not the act, but the void where a soul should have been. As they led her out, a woman in the gallery, Teresa, I think, whispered, "Margaret deserved better." She did. A retired secretary who'd spent her life helping others, reduced to bones in a ditch by a girl she'd saved from the streets. The trial answered the big questions. Who, why, where? But the small ones haunted me. What did Margaret feel in those last moments? Did she know Teresa, her little shadow, had turned on her? I'd never shake that image. An old woman trusting, a young one plotting, and a park swallowing the aftermath. Justice was served, but it didn't heal the wound. Teresa's cruelty, her calm, her lies, her utter lack of regret, left a stain. She'd rot in prison, but Margaret was still gone. That's the truth I carried out of that courtroom. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just stares back, silent and unrepentant. It's been over a decade since Teresa Alvarez went down for Margaret Theut's murder, but some nights, I still hear the wind howling through Rouge Park. That case carved something out of me, left a hollow that fills with questions when the world gets quiet. I've seen plenty of killers, but Teresa was different. Not loud, not wild, just a shadow that slipped through lives, leaving rot behind. Standing in that courtroom in December 2013, watching her get hauled off to a life sentence, I thought I'd feel closure. I didn't. Justice doesn't bring back the dead, and it doesn't erase the why. Rouge Park still looms in my mind, dark, sprawling, a silent witness to the end of Margaret's story. I'd walk those trails sometimes after the trial, trying to piece together the gaps. How did Teresa look Margaret in the eye that night? Did she smile as she handed her that coffee, knowing what was in it? The park swallowed those answers, just like it swallowed Margaret's bones for 6 long months. That's the mystery that lingers, not the evidence, but the heart of it. A girl rescued from homelessness turned on the woman who'd saved her, and she did it with a coldness that defies reason. Teresa's cruelty wasn't in the violence. It was in the planning, the lies, the way she danced through life after. She'd wrapped Margaret's body like a gift, dumped her in a place tied to their shared past, then spent her money without a blink. That's not just evil, it's a void. And it's a warning. People like her don't wear their malice on their sleeves. They smile, they charm, they wait. Margaret trusted her, and it cost her everything. So here's what I'll leave you with. Watch the shadows. The gate left open, the story that doesn't add up, the friend who's a little too eager to help. They're signs. Margaret didn't see them, and I couldn't save her. But you can save yourself. Evil doesn't always roar. It whispers. And by the time you hear it, it's too late. Rouge Park taught me that. Don't let it teach you too.